welcome everybody. I just want to can welcome everybody to this webinar presented by the Guides Association of New York. Um, and I'm just going to check in the chat. People come pop in, say hi. Let me know if you hear me. Everybody should have access to a chat window or something like that. So let me know if you can hear me out there. And we'll get going here. My name is John Sumlek, and I'm a member of the Education Committee of the Guides Association of New York. If you're not familiar with our organization, you can look us up at www.GANYC.org. You can, if you're a licensed New York City tour guide, you can join us. So that's who we are. We are all licensed New York City tour guides. Or you could follow our events and things that we offer for the public and so on. I am incredibly honored today to be joined by a real legend in New York's culinary scene and tour guiding scene, Scott Wiener, who is, as I have been told by many sources, leads the best New York City pizza tours, but I'm sure there's other people who have a voice in that, but I'm just going to say that now. And he's going to give us a wonderful presentation called Busting New York Pizza Myths and Legends. I know he has some materials to send to you afterwards and things like that. And I'm not going to take up any more time. This is Scott's show. So, Scott, you can take it away now.
All right, John, thank you so much for the intro. I want to just give a quick heads up to everybody that the chat is disabled for this program. So if you have anything to say, especially if you have any questions, just throw them right into the Q&A. So there will be no chat.
About that. Okay, my fault that I had asked people to hit chat just in case. I'm really sorry. I do apologize for that, Scott. Minor miscommunication there. I will not bother
Totally
you
cool.
anymore.
Totally okay. But this is actually perfect because if you have great reminder time, if you have any questions at all, please drop them in the Q&A. The way that this program is going to run is I'm going to present some information, and then we're going to have an open Q&A session where I'll be joined by two other people. There's going to be Peter Regas and Stephanie Swan. These are two other pizza researchers, professional pizza nerds like me, and they're going to join me to help explain some of this information. So the first thing I want to do is just, beyond thanking you all for coming, is to let you know that this will be recorded. It's being recorded right now. So afterwards, you're going to get probably a link to the GANYC YouTube channel where you can watch the video. You're also going to get an email from me with a PDF of the basic bullet points of what I'm about to present. The reason I want to do that is because it's a whole lot of information. This program is the in-depth version. The PDF will be the bullet point version. And if anybody is going to the GANYC meeting tonight, you'll get a printout similar to what I'm sending you guys all in a PDF. You'll get that at the GANYC meeting tonight, where I'll be presenting a very short bullet point version of this presentation. So that being said, I'm really glad you're all here. And for those who don't know what GANYC is, as John just mentioned, it's the Guides Association of New York City. So everyone who's a tour guide has to be licensed in New York City. And then if you're licensed, you can become a member of GANYC, the Guides Association of New York City. And it's an organization that's really interested in self-education. So they lead these tours called FAM tours, familiarization tours, where you, as a tour guide, you can learn something about a piece of the city or a piece of the history that you don't know. And this is a piece that a lot of people don't know, because my luxury as a pizza tour guide slash pizza tour company operator is that, unlike most tour guides in New York who know about a lot of different things, I know a lot about one thing, and that's it. It's my luxury. And so that's why a presentation like this is going to be helpful, because not only is this a perfect timing being National Pizza Month, which is true, but also it's great timing for this because toward the end of the year, I feel like it's a good reset moment. There's a lot of information out there about pizza that gets repeated, regurgitated. It goes into the realm of hearsay, mythology, folklore, And this is a little reset that I want to give you just to provide some of the information that's factual. Because what we do on our pizza tours is all about objectivity. It's not just about eating a slice. What do you think? That's not so interesting to me. What's more interesting is understanding the stories and the reasons for why things work the way they work. And pizza is a huge piece of that puzzle for me personally. That's why it's my obsession. So once again, I'm going to go through some big bullet points, and then at the end we'll do a Q&A where I'll answer anything that pops into the Q&A section. So if you have any questions throughout the presentation, just pop it in there right now, and I'll be trying to interject if I can answer anything right off the bat. And if I can't, I want to save it for the Q&A where we'll be joined by two other people. So I want to explain where some of this information is coming from, because I mentioned a second ago how information becomes hearsay, and then that information gets regurgitated in every time there's an article about pizza, every time there's the new top 50 list always starts with a lead that drops 2 or 3 morsels of like common knowledge information, which very often end up being out of date information. And so the same thing happens when people are running tours. And I hear it on the streets. I hear a tour guide say something that falls into the realm of great story, but not so much factual. And so that's why this information is going to be presented here. It's not our fault that we sometimes regurgitate information that's not accurate. It's because you can read any one of the 10 billion articles about pizza published in the past 75 years, and that information goes back. So that's why I want to use this as a good reset. And I want to explain where I'm getting some information. So first of all, there are lots of resources that I use when I'm doing research. And this is just a page to let you know what some of that information is. Obviously, public library, the tax photo archive, Center for Brooklyn History, which was the Brooklyn Historical Society. Websites like ancestry.com are great for genealogy. Newspapers.com is great. If you're interested in any of these resources, just let me know. And I'm happy to have a separate conversation. We could talk about how digging up this information is really fun. There's also not just me out there. There are other people out there who do research like this. And the ones who I speak with the most are Peter Regis, Colin Kaplan, and Stephanie Swan on behalf of Modernist. So I know a question just popped up in the Q&A that I see the term New Haven. Colin Kaplan, who's in the center over here, runs Taste of New Haven tours, wrote a book called Pizza in New Haven. It's on this bookshelf. I can show it to you later. Peter Regis on the top there has been working on a book called, and his website is pizzahistorybook.com. Incredible resource about pizza history. And has done, to me, the most research and has found the most interesting information. Stephanie Swan is the publisher of Modernist books. So Modernist always comes out with these tomes of information, and they released Modernist Pizza a couple of years ago, 3 years ago. And it's like a 1,700 page, 3-volume set. It's ridiculous. I have gold stars next to Peter's name and Stephanie's name because they'll be joining for the Q&A portion. Colin, it doesn't get a gold star because he can't join us because he's in Italy right now. So he doesn't need the gold star. Also, I want to draw your attention to some other great resources. These are just some great websites that have well-researched information. I find that websites like history.com or historychannel.com, they're more like regurgitating Google search info. These are some sources where the writers are really doing a lot of research. So that's always fun. We're going to dive into these myths, and the way that I'm going to take care of it is we're going to do probably 5 or 6 main myths, and then within those there are some little micro myths. If there's time, I'm locked and loaded for a couple of extra things, but we'll really see what happens. And I want to remind you, any questions you have, just drop them in the Q&A. If something that you want to share is not a question, I would advise you to not drop it in the Q&A, just because I want to try to keep this as tight as possible. And I don't want to spend too much time talking about everybody's favorite pizzerias. That's a whole other conversation. So let's jump into myth number 1. Okay, this is a really, really big one. And the myth is that it's illegal to build a coal-fired oven in New York City. And the thing that I always hear all the time on tours, hey, isn't it illegal to build these things now? Don't you have to be grandfathered in to have one of these ovens right now? And the answer is no. Let's unpack that for a little bit. So first of all, to explain coal-fired ovens, a coal-fired oven is an oven that's burning anthracite coal. It's a very, very dense coal. And to build these ovens, the structure of the oven has to allow air to flow up through the coal. As that coal heats up the air travels across the oven and it exhausts usually out of the opposite corner of the oven from the air intake. And so that's why this picture I'm showing you of John's of Bleecker Street's oven, it's a coal-fired oven. It has an air intake. It has an air output in the back left corner, and they shovel coal into the oven twice a day. So anthracite coal, we need to go into a little bit of detail about that. This is a coal map of the United States. And you'll see, if you look really closely at the bottom, there's a little bit of a key. And to make it easier for you, I will show you arrows. The big swaths of coal we have in the United States are bituminous coal. That's a soft coal. We burn that for power plants. And that's the most common coal in the United States. Then we have this little tiny pocket of anthracite coal in the northeast corner of Pennsylvania, right outside of Scranton. It's the only coal in North America. It's about 484 square miles of anthracite coal. Anthracite is extremely dense, 85 to 92% carbon. And so when the Erie Canal opened in 1825, it happened to go right past where the anthracite area is and on your way to the highly industrialized northeastern United States, which just so happened to be where lots of Southern Italian immigrants were living. And so pizzerias popped up all along the Northeast, and they didn't use wood-fired ovens in the way that they did back in Southern Italy. Instead, they used anthracite coal because it was cheap. And this is a little mini myth over here. They're using anthracite coal not because of any flavoring, not because it's going to do anything better than wood would. It's only because anthracite coal was cheap. That's the only reason. But since anthracite coal was so inexpensive, they had to design ovens to burn anthracite. And an oven that burns anthracite is designed differently from an oven that would burn wood. And that's because you need the air intake that I showed you earlier. So a lot of the ovens in New York City that burn coal, especially in the mid to late 19th century, into the early 20th century, they're built not inside the building. They're not appliances. They're built outside the building, and they're actually built as extensions into the backyards of the spaces. And so this is where it gets really interesting. I want to show you just a blueprint of this is a building in Brooklyn that the building up in the front on the left side of the image, that's a 3-story building with a cellar. Then to the right, you see a 1-story extension, and that's the bakery extension with the oven all the way in the back. So if you look really closely, you'll see a little oven toward the very far right side of the image. And then you'll see a little chimney up in the front. This is just to give you an idea of coal-fired ovens and how they existed at that time, really around the late 1800s, early 1900s. And to really make it stick better, and because somebody mentioned New Haven in the Q&A section, I want to transition this image to the image of a pizzeria in New Haven, Connecticut, because it's much easier to see the profile of a building in New Haven, Connecticut than it is to do that in New York City, where you can't see the profile of most buildings. If you look closely, this is Frank Pepe's Pizza Napolitana on Worcester Street in New Haven. And to the right of the image, you see this 1-floor extension with a chimney. And that 1-floor extension is a different color brick from the rest of the building. And that's because this oven was built after the original building. And I'm showing this to you because when you look at how this works in New York City, where we don't have parking lots next to pizzerias, if you look at the old Sanborn maps, these are the fire insurance maps. On fire insurance maps, they will identify fire hazards. And so a great fire hazard to look for is a bake oven, any kind of oven. And these ovens are all indicated by these black squares. The buildings are also listed as bakeries. So I'm showing you a few of these that show the oven built as an extension off the rear of the building. There's another variation on this where the oven is built as an extension off the front of the building, but not at street level. It's in the sub-level, so under the sidewalk, in the vault. So these are two ways that it works, which is why we've had these in New York City, but nobody wants to build them now because they take up a lot of space. And if you have one of these ovens, it really gets in the way. You cannot, as a building owner, add apartments on top of an oven. And so the myth about not having any new coal-fired ovens in New York City has more to do with how hard they are to build and how hard they are and how expensive they are to get permitting and to run. But I do want to give you some good information here about existing coal-fired pizzerias. So I put together a list. Feel free to screenshot this. I'll also send it to you after the presentation. So this is a list by borough of pizzerias that are in current operation that use coal-fired ovens. If I'm missing any, please throw it in the Q&A and say, hey, doesn't so-and-so have a coal-fired oven? And then I'll make sure if I'm missing any to add them to this list. But this is a list of 21 pizzerias. You'll also notice that those little gold stars on here, those indicate pizza ovens that were built prior to 1950. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. The rest of them are all ovens that were built really after 1990. And so to say that it's illegal to build a coal-fired oven in New York City, it's not true. And a lot of why people say that you can't build a coal-fired oven in New York City has to do with emissions. Well, there are plenty of emissions regulations that people have to deal with. So as a business owner, you can't, you do have a lot of trouble getting permitting for a coal-fired oven. There was a place called Massa's that opened in Long Island City maybe 6 or 7 years ago. It closed during COVID, but they managed to get permitting. They had a coal-fired oven. It worked just fine. Now, somebody brought up in the Q&A a question that I thought was going to come up about Lombardi's. Lombardi's is not on the list because Lombardi's no longer has a coal-fired oven. Lombardi's, actually, this is Lombardi's, or this was Lombardi's. So this is Lombardi's original location, which is at 53.5 Spring Street. When they closed, they were closed for 10 years. They reopened one block east at 32 Spring Street in a space that was the Scudieri Bakery, then became the Parisi Bakery. It's an old bakery space. When Lombardi's reopened there in 1994, they did so because there was an oven already built into the rear of the building. During COVID, Lombardi's had to choose between 2 leases. They were paying 2 landlords, building on the corner and the building that had the oven that was one in from the corner. They couldn't keep the building that was one in, so they ended the lease, and the new owner of that building, who just had purchased the building, demolished the oven April of 2022. And so they have not had a coal oven in the past couple of years. They've had an electric oven. They still make very good pizza out of that electric oven, but it's no longer a coal oven. Somebody else also brought up that isn't coal bad for the environment? So any solid fuel, when you burn it, will let off emissions. And emissions are the thing that, well, we all know climate change is being driven by emissions. Pizza emissions are not that high, but it's tougher on breathing air than it is really on like global impact and global environment, which is why the New York City DEP passed a law in 2016, and then they made a little bit of a revision just last year, which requires the installation of these units, scrubbers. So this 2016 law said any solid fuel burning cook stove, and that's the exact language, any solid fuel burning cook stove built after 2016 must have installed emissions suppression units, which they call scrubbers. So if you look at this image, which is creased, because this is literally a scan of a brochure that I took from this company, these are built in, I think they're built in Italy, and then they're brought into New York State. The scrubber is the unit that the exhaust comes out of the oven. It goes through the scrubber. It sprays moisture, it sprays water into the exhaust, and that water traps emissions. So what leaves the exhaust out of the building is cleaner, and what gets trapped is gross. You clean it out every week, and then you're good to go. I didn't say that this law was only about pizza ovens. It's any solid fuel burning cook stove. Coal-fired ovens are not legislated any differently from a fireplace or a wood-burning barbecue pit or anything like that. And that's why this company sells for fire pits. They sell them for these things. Coal and wood are both legislated the same way. Something just came up in the Q&A that Ed heard that anthracite is widely used in New York City for heating earlier part of the 20th century since it produced less soot. Now, that may be true, and it certainly does produce less soot, but the big reason is that It has higher BTUs than wood, takes up less space, far more dense, and it's just easier to store. Any of you who live in New York City know that space is at a premium. So taking up a third the amount of space with coal is a nice idea. And that's why anthracite coal is really being used. Not for flavor, nothing like that. And I should also mention, I see this mistake in some food writing. Coal does not get hotter than wood. It has higher BTUs, but because of the way that the ovens are built and the way that air has to flow through them, they don't, coal ovens don't actually get hotter than wood-fired ovens. A wood-fired oven has a higher top potential, around 1,000 Fahrenheit, and coal ovens really sit more in the 700-degree Fahrenheit range. So to say that coal is hotter than wood is just incorrect. Another question came up from Robin about asking about, are the coal-fired places that I mentioned ovens that are extensions of their buildings? So this is a reference to this image. So the ones with the stars next to them, some of them have ovens that are extensions of the buildings. Michelangelo's in the Bronx, and this place called Party On, which used to be called Verdi Coal Oven, 254 Irving in Bushwick, Brooklyn. Actually, Party On is below the sidewalk. Michelangelo's is out the rear. It used to be a bakery called Pietro's. John's of Bleecker, Patsy's in Harlem, and Arturo's all have smaller modular ovens that were built later. Now, this is a list of currently operational coal-fired pizzerias in New York City. I did not include coal-fired ovens that are just sitting there. I also didn't include coal-fired ovens that are being used for bread bakeries. That's a whole other issue. I really just wanted to show you coal-fired pizzerias for now, just because, it's pizza month. So great question. I love the questions that are coming up, and I'm going to keep answering what I can as we go. And then if there's anything that I might be able to wait, then we'll wait toward the end. So the next thing I want to jump into after coal-fired is a second myth here. And yeah, before we move on, it is legal to build a coal-fired oven in New York City. It is not easy and it is not cheap. To install the scrubbers is tens of thousands of dollars. Oh, and I mentioned that the law said post 2016 ovens had to install scrubbers. As of last summer, the law has been also updated to include any pre-2016 oven now has to install the same thing. Those scrubbers have to reduce emissions by 75%. There's a bunch of omissions and loopholes that are possible. So this is not devastating to New York pizza. No pizzerias have closed because of it. And many pizzerias have already complied before this became an issue in the news. So if you're somebody who got really riled up when this hit the news and you said, oh, everything's going to change, John's Pizzeria on Bleecker Street had already done it and nobody noticed. So this is all good news. Myth number 2. This one we're going to dig into a lot when we have our Q&A session, because Peter Regas has done a ton of research about this, and I just want to give you some surface, and I want to let Peter dig into it a little bit later. I'm going to show you some images that Peter found. So this way we'll do. Okay, so pizza came to the US in 1905, and actually this kind of harkens back to the mention of Lombardi's. So the 1905 year is because the information that has been in every article about pizza really since the 50s has mentioned Lombardi's being the first pizzeria in the United States and it opening in 1905. We're going to unwind how neither of those things is accurate. Lombardi's is actually kind of older than they think they are, but still not the first. But let's start by talking about the earliest evidence. This is a great piece that this is really important. This is a piece that Peter Regas is a Chicago-based researcher. His website is pizzahistorybook.com. And one of the places that we always look for information are business directories and census records and address directories. He found a business directory from 1894 where it lists bakers. Of course, there's always a list of bakers. And then there's always a separate list, which is interesting. That's different types of bakers, cracker bakers, pie bakers. And then within one of those lists was a funny anomaly. So on the right side, you'll see that there's a list of names. And then suddenly the fourth one down is the word pizzeria, which whoever was canvassing for the book must have made the mistake of thinking that this was the name of somebody written on the window, but really it was the name of a business, which is Pizzeria Forno E, or Forno e Pizzeria, oven, literally, forno, or bakery, colloquially, bakery and pizzeria, listed at 59.5 Mulberry Street in 1894. This is the earliest conclusive evidence of a pizzeria in the United States. I said that really slowly just because I know sometimes I'll read in articles that, oh, there's some debate. This is a primary source, like the primary source here, of the earliest known evidence as of today, October 9th, 2024, unless Peter found something yesterday, of a pizzeria in the United States. So it's interesting because this building was demolished 3 years later to make way for what is now Columbus Park. So the building's not there anymore. The oven's not there anymore. We have no building records, no blueprints, nothing. It's really tough. It's this one little anomaly. So we don't know what was the first pizzeria in the United States. We may never know that. All we know is what we know, which is that as of right now, this is the earliest evidence of a pizzeria in the United States. And I want to compare it to another business directory, just so you get an idea of how these things work. And this one's from 1907, and it's specifically an Italian business directory. And these are really amazing because they list every city in the US and all the Italian businesses. None of these are complete, or I think it's safe to assume nothing is complete. But in this, we see a list of names under a section that says bakers, comma, pie, comma, etc., which a pie could be anything, but it says dash pizzeria, which is wonderful. It means that we know that this includes or maybe even totally describes pizzerias. And in 1907, we have this list. There's one listed on Morris Avenue in the Bronx, Pizzeria Napolitana. There you go, just so you see another version of this. So let's dig into the Lombardi story a little bit, because I mentioned that they're older than the 1905 year, but still, as we already see, not the first. So this is a famous image. I will refer to this as the famous image. So later on, if we're not looking at it, if I say the famous image, I'm talking about this photo that has two men standing on the front steps, a dog in between them, a man wearing a bowler cap on the cellar steps down below, a banana cart, and a window full of tomato cans. And it says right on the window, Pizzeria Napolitana, Gennaro Lombardi, proprietor, 53 1/2. And at the bottom of the image, it says Lombardi's in 1905. So we can ignore that on the bottom because that was added in the 90s when Lombardi's reopened. And it goes along with the family story, which we can dive into a little bit about why it might not be super accurate. But what you have to know about these two people in the picture is the man on the right is Gennaro Lombardi, and the man on the left is Antonio Pirro, or Totono. So if you've been to Totono's on Coney Island, that's Antonio Pirro. So an issue with the story starts to get interesting when I started doing pizza tours in 2008, I was doing research to kind of confirm the stories that I'd heard, and I wasn't finding mention of Lombardi's in 1905 or Gennaro Lombardi as a baker or as a pizzeria owner in 1905. This picture was really the one resource we had, and the picture has a lot of clues in it, which reveal that this photo was not taken in 1905, but in 1908. So I want to quickly go through those clues, just so you have an understanding of, how much detail there is in a great photo like this. I want you to look at, there's posters in the front window. There's one poster in particular that I want to really focus in on. And this is a poster that if we really zoom in on it, we can read, it says, it's a 14th Ward event, which is this part of town. This is 53 1/2 Spring Street. And it says right on it, Wednesday, 25 November, which is incredible to have that information, because as long as this poster is current and not a few years old stuck in the window, we can assume that Wednesday, 25 November, if you line it up, it could have been not 1905, it would have been 1903, 1908, or 1914. And it's pretty simple to pull apart what year it could have been, because when you start to look at the ship manifests for the two guys in the photo, you You see, Gennaro Lombardi doesn't get to the United States until 1904. So that already rules out the 1903 year because he's in the picture. It says his name on the front window. And these are easy to find. You can look these up. They're on ancestry.com. There's probably a million other websites. Ancestry is just really easy to use and to keep track of things. The other one that's interesting here is when you look up Antonio Pirro, he comes over in 1903. So it gives you a little bit of an alignment about, okay, well, we know it's not 1903 from the other one. From Antonio Pirro, interesting to see he was here before Gennaro landed, great. But what makes it even more interesting is we see by 1910, Antonio Pirro is living on Coney Island and working at a restaurant in Coney Island, which means that, well, it makes it tougher for this to be a 1914 photo if he's already down in Coney Island working at another restaurant in 1910. It doesn't mean that he couldn't be working two jobs or that by 1914 he couldn't have swapped back to working in Manhattan. But another piece of information, this is the funny stuff with why you have to collaborate with people. I talked to Peter about this, and Peter said, well, I found this one document that's really helpful. He found an alteration document from 1912 that shows that the front steps of the building were widened in 1912. And since the famous photo shows an image that has the pre-alteration stairs, we now know that this photo could not have been after 1912, which is why we believe strongly that it's a 1908 photo. So if that's the information we have that puts a pin in the years for 1908, the question comes up with, well, what was happening before 1908 in that spot? So fortunately, there are a few ads that give us some information. So this is an ad from, those books, images of, and then it says a neighborhood, or they're like the sepia tone books. This is from Images of Little Italy by Dr. Aliandri, which came out, I don't remember what year it came out, but this ad appears in the book on the same page as a photo of Lombardi's, but it doesn't draw the connection between the two, which now that you've seen the famous photo of 53.5 Spring Street, when you look at the address on this ad, you see 53 Spring Street again in 1907 with two other owners listed. So interesting stuff. I don't need to bore you with go through the genealogy, but these two guys, we've confirmed they're listed in business directories. They're both in that location in the years that this ad covers. So we know that this is for real. This is not, it's a confirmed date. There's another great ad from 1904 where it lists right here, 53.5 Spring Street between Mulberry and Marion Streets. Marion became Lafayette. And it's a 1904 ad. It's got great information. It's got a great drawing, wonderful doodle that shows a coal-fired oven. Unbelievable, a coal-fired oven at the original location at 53 Spring Street. And I want you to keep in mind this name, Giovanni Santillo, because it'll come up in a couple seconds again. Giovanni Santillo in 1904, okay, seems like that's the proprietor. It's confirmed by this listing in a business directory under the Baker's, Pie section. Santillo Giovanni, 53.5 Spring Street. And also a nice little mini answer to a question that maybe you've always had in your head. Why do we call it a pie? Pie was the way that we described what pizza was. Early English writing about pizza is described as an Italian tomato pie, an Italian pie. And so that word just stuck. The word pizza does not translate to pie. It's a colloquialism. It has changed its meaning over the years. The word pizza does not have a direct translation. So to say pizza pie is not really redundant. It's pie is how we listed it in these business directories. So this is the listing for Giovanni Santillo. So we know that the ad's legit. So now we've got this going back to the early 1900s, before that 1905 establishment date that Lombardi's has in the photo. So then the question becomes, well, how can we nail down an origin of this place? And one way to do it is to talk about the oven. And the ovens are really interesting, as we've just discussed. This is just a clip of the building alteration application from 1898 to build the oven at 53 Spring Street. And it says, plain as day, build a bake oven of brick It shows the dimensions of that oven. It describes the oven, or something very close to the oven that we saw earlier. That's the oven after the alteration. This picture was taken in, I think, 1956. So there we have it. 1898 is the origin of that oven, which we can assume somewhere in the flow of 1898 up till, I think, 1901 might be the earliest ad I've seen for a pizzeria at this location. And another great thing that Peter found was the name of the person who was renting the space at the time was this guy, who you may have heard this name because when Peter dug this stuff up, there was some great press coverage. I want to say it was 2019, maybe early 2020. But so there was some press coverage that said, hey, new information has come up about early pizzerias in America. But of course, the stories and the legends and the myths tend to stick a little bit more, which is why a presentation like this might be important to reinforce. This is the name of the guy who was running the space at the time. Very likely the founder of the pizzeria that eventually became Lombardi's in 1898 is probably when it opened. Early 1889. I'm sorry, 1899. So this is an interesting part of the story. Lombardi's probably older than they think they are, but still not the earliest, because even this gentleman, Filippo Maloney, had pizzerias in New York City before that year. So we're going to move on to the next myth. But first, I want to check the Q&A section because there's some great questions in here that I know we are going to answer later. Like there's a question about the oldest photo of pizza in the US and the oldest photo of pizza in Italy. We will definitely talk about that when we get Peter and Stephanie on. Another question came up about a list of places that closed that used coal. And there's a great, and the answer is I have a list that I keep in my phone all the time. And one of them that's mentioned in this was Luzzo's, which used to be the Palermo Bake Shop at 211-213 First Avenue on the west side of the street. They've been closed for 3 years, 4 years. It's available if anybody wants it. Coal-fired oven sitting right there. And then Bella Via in Long Island City. Oh, and there's plenty more. So that's a great question to bring up. But I want to jump into the next myth. I'm going to try to keep these next few ones pretty short and get through the big five and then jump into answering questions. So this next one has to do with, again, the extension of the Lombardi story, which is that New York City's earliest pizza makers all got their start at Lombardi's, which it is not true. And I want to really dive into why we think that, and not to throw blame on anyone, but there was an article published in 1998 in the New York Times that served as a main piece of information that I presented to tours for probably 4 or 5 years, maybe 6 years, giving people information based on this, which as it turns out is not super correct. So this is actually a really great article about pizza in New York City, which is sort of a result of when Grimaldi's opened, or when Grimaldi's opened under the Brooklyn Bridge in 1990, it was called Patsy's. And when that happened, that was the first coal-fired pizzeria in New York City, really, to open since the late 50s, probably. And when they opened, it inspired other places. 1990 was Grimaldi's, or Patsy's at the time. 1994 was the rebirth of Lombardi's. And then after that, in 1997, John's opened up other locations. Totonno's started opening up other locations. So we had this kind of rebirth of the classic coal-fired pizza of New York City, which sort of disappeared as the gas-fired oven took over and pizza by the slice became the famous pizza of New York City. So this article was really cool to reapproach this stuff. But I want to kind of explain why some of the stuff is not totally there. Let's start with Totonno's, because we talked about Antonio Pirro earlier. So the image on the left is the tax photo of Totonno's, 1524 Neptune Avenue in Brooklyn, Coney Island. And on the right, you see Totonno in the famous photo in front of 53 Spring Street. So really great story. We talked about how Totonno came to the United States in 1903. We also talked about all these other people who were making pizza in the 1900s. And all we have to do is look closely at the ship manifest, which I had sort of grayed out before, but we're going to really zoom in on it. And Antonio Pirro is the last line on this. And unbelievable piece of information he has here. In the column where you say where you're going to go, who you're going to live with, it says Uncle Giovanni Santillo of 53 Spring Street, of Spring Street 53, which is an unbelievable piece of information. In 1903, Giovanni Santillo, who was not Antonio Piro's uncle, as far as I've been able to tell, um, he's the destination. Antonio Piro comes to America as a baker, as a pizza maker, which Lombardi did not. He works at the pizzeria that exists in the space before it becomes other pizzerias and then eventually Lombardi's. So remember, 53.5 Spring Street with our boy Giovanni Santillo. This is where Antonio Piro learned. I guess kind of as a stretch, you could say, well, it was at the restaurant that became Lombardi's. But I think the words get mashed up over time. And a lot of articles will say these people were trained by Gennaro Lombardi, and that would be an inaccurate statement. To say that it happened at the pizzeria that became Lombardi's is more accurate. So there we go. Being trained before Lombardi. Next up, we'll talk about John's on Bleecker Street. John's on Bleecker Street's another really interesting one. We won't spend too much time on it, but again, if you ever want any deeper information about any of this, let me know. And I'll send you all the details. I'll send you links to every document. Big bullet points about John's on Bleecker Street. John Sasso is the name of the guy. He's right in the center. The pizzeria was not founded by John, and it was not originally on Bleecker Street. And there's some other details on this page you can kind of look at it. Basically about how John's moved around year to year. But I really want to dive into showing you a couple of business certificates just to show you how this story goes and how we know that John probably did not learn from Gennaro Lombardi. So first is a 1939 business license. This is the first business certificate that calls John's. This is when the restaurant had moved to its current location on Bleecker Street, 278 Bleecker Street. So keep that in mind. It's called John's Pizzeria in 1939 when it had just moved to 278 Bleecker Street, current location. You go back a little bit further, and John Sasso's name is on a business certificate in 1934, I think is this one. In 1934, he had moved to McDougal Street, 51 McDougal, which is on the corner of Houston and McDougal. It's currently the location of Hamburger America. So it went from pizza to burgers. But this place, when John Sasso ran it, before he moved it to Bleecker Street, it had a different name. It was called Pizzeria Napoletana Original Port Alba. It's a mouthful. But, and it depends on, do you consider that to be the same pizzeria? It changed name, it changed location. This is like a semantics argument that I don't think we need to get into, but John Sasso, prior to 1939, was at 51 McDougal Street. Prior to that, he was at 175 Sullivan Street. So this is the 1925 business directory where you see John Sasso is also listed in a business directory as a baker at Pizzeria Port Alba in this year. So we know he was there. He was the guy. And it was called Pizzeria Port Alba. Now, Pizzeria Port Alba is a name that had been used on a lot of pizzerias. It references the name of a pizzeria in Naples, Italy, which is, some say was the first pizzeria in Naples, the oldest, whatever. It's an old place, definitely an old place, and it's still around. Now, the partner that John had when it was at this location, 175 Sullivan Street, was none other than that same guy we saw earlier, who opened the pizzeria on Spring Street that became Lombardi's, Filippo Maloney. Now, Filippo Maloney, this photo is from an ad from another pizzeria, by the way. That's why I haven't shown you this stuff. But this was another ad found by Peter, pizzeria on 192 Grand Street that he called Antica Pizzeria Port Alba. He used that name a lot. This was the uncle of John Sasso's wife, who partnered with John when John's wife, Jenny, died in 1920. John partnered with Filippo Maloney. Filippo Maloney died, I think, in 1924. And then John takes over, carries on the place. The reason I'm showing you this is because this pizzeria in this location, I should say, well, let's not look at that. In the original location on Sullivan Street, goes all the way back to 1916. And because of the timing of the publication of the directory, probably was open in 1915. And so to say since 1929 is a mystery. Nobody there knows why it says 1929. And up until the late 1990s, the awning actually said since 1934. So it's a little confusing, but the pizzeria that John started as goes all the way back to 1916, probably 1915 on Sullivan Street. And if you look at the signage in the window to this day, this is why I think there's a strong case for John's having this common line going all the way back to that place on Sullivan. Port Alba is still on the sign in the front window, still on the neon. So John's Pizzeria, Port Alba, has the longest confirmed paper trail of any pizzeria in the United States. There are other pizzerias that claim to have opened in 1914, one in 1912, that are still open to this day. They've moved locations, they've changed names, but there's no confirmed paper trail yet. This is currently the longest confirmed paper trail of any pizzeria in the US. We got to talk about Pasquale Lancieri, Patsy. This is another one where some of the years, it's hard to tell why some of the years get quoted the way they do. The year on this was 1933. It's said often that Patsy worked for Lombardi. I don't know if you remember this. We can go back to this for a second. In that Times article, there is a dotted line that goes to Patsy's. So when this came out, it was a question. The family said that, oh, Patsy never worked downtown. It was all the way up in East Harlem on 117th and First Avenue. It's still there in this building to this day. No evidence that he worked downtown. In fact, the reason I pointed out the lineage of John's is that you do see a way that John got into the business. That way does not involve 53 Spring Street or Gennaro Lombardi. So the same thing happens here. If you look really closely at this photo, this is a 1937 photo. And I won't make you squint too much. I'll zoom in here. This is so interesting. On the front window, it says the name of the proprietor, L. Megale, which is not P. Lancieri. L. Megale, that last name, Megale, is the last name of Patsy's wife, Carmela, her maiden name, Megale. Here's their marriage license. I'm sorry, their marriage certificate. So great information on all these documents. This one is really helpful here because not only do we see he married a Carmela Megale, but without even looking into her genealogy, you see that there's a witness to the marriage who's Lorenzo Megale, L. Megale, her brother. So in 1935, they are married, June 25th, it says it right there on the stamp on the bottom. And at that time, there's no restaurant pizzeria listed at that location on First Avenue, 2287 First Avenue. It enters the phone book as being owned by Lorenzo Megale in 1937. I'm sorry, the business directory, not the phone book. And then we don't see Patsy owning it until 1940. I think the first time he's listed, 1940 or 1941. So we see a direct way that he could have gotten into this particular business through his brother-in-law. But there's also some information out there that says, well, he worked as a baker. There's a 1925 census where he says he works as a baker. I saw an article at one point that said, this is an article quoting somebody that said he worked as a baker in a pastry shop until 1933 when he left to open his own place on First Avenue. We don't see that pizzeria. We don't have the evidence of it opening. The year could be a question, but the bottom line here is he got into the business through the brother-in-law. And even in this year, in 1935, his occupation is pastry cook. Is it possible that he was making pizzas and considered that a pastry? Sure, it's possible. But the bottom line is we don't see any evidence of a crossover with Lombardi's downtown. We're going to do the quickest myth in the whole day here. Is we're going to talk about this for hopefully less than 2 minutes. Everybody says that the secret of New York's pizza is the tap water, which is just patently false. And I'm going to say it as simply and hopefully not being offensive. There's probably about 3,000 pizzerias in New York City. They all use the water, the tap water. They are not all great. I know every pizzeria is somebody's favorite, but they're not all amazing. The tap water is not a silver bullet. Also, as much as New Yorkers will not want to admit it, there is amazing pizza all over the country that can be made the same way as New York's water. Our water, when you see somebody say that, oh, it's a secret is the water, then you ask them to explain why, they'll usually say something about, well, it's because of its high mineral content, or they'll throw a bunch of information, which is not true. New York's water is soft. It's low mineral content. It's relatively low chlorine. Um, it's unfiltered, although, well, currently, as of like this week, it's a little different, but normally it's mostly unfiltered because it's coming from the Delaware and the Catskill Reservoir system. I say now it's a little different because, as you may have heard, there's repairs happening right now with one of the supply lines, which means that now we're taking what is normally just 10% of our water supply from the Croton reservoirs. Now we're taking about half of our water supply that is a filtered water supply, which means that our water will change for the next 5 to 8 months, maybe more. I don't think our pizza is going to change. If you ask any pizza maker, I find that pizza makers who have trouble making good pizza and try to blame the water very often just don't understand fermentation. And when we talk with Stephanie from Modernist in a few minutes, that book did a thorough analysis. And there's another thorough analysis, which I'm showing you here. If you want, you can click and scan this. This will get you the Department of Environmental Protection's Water Supply and Quality Report. It comes out every year. I haven't seen the 2024 one yet, but it might be out. Anyway, this explains to you what's happening in the water. Our water is not consistent year to year. Even from month to month, we use more chlorine in the summer. And you might think, oh, well, that chlorine is going to kill off all these yeast and bacteria in our dough. No, not even at the max legal limit for chlorine in drinking water, it will not. So I hate to say it, but the reason that our pizza, I don't think that New York's pizza is exceptionally better than everyone else. And, I'll say that bagels are also becoming great in other places. It's just that we have a long history, and the way that we eat pizza in New York is different from other cities. Our by the slice culture is because our city is tight, the spaces are small, and the business model of having pizza by the slice can work here, where in a place like Los Angeles, where everybody's driving a car, it doesn't work as well. So this is why to say that pizza is better in New York because of the water, it's just inaccurate and incomplete. And we don't need to talk too much about it, because I do want to get into one final thing, because I know that there are so many people who are probably joining us who are not in New York City. And I invited a lot of people from outside of New York City because New York pizza history is America's pizza history, is the world's pizza history. And there's other pizza history that I see being flubbed all the time. And because it's fun to talk about. This is like an anti-New York thing at the moment, I want to say. We have to talk about this for a second about Hawaiian pizza. Don't throw something at your computer. Don't worry. And if you don't like it, I don't care. It's fine, because I want to talk about the history of it. A lot of people like to talk about Hawaiian pizza, forgetting about whether or not you like it. I don't care about that. But it being invented by a Greek immigrant in Canada in the early 1960s. So I want to take you on a little timeline trip with me. Come join me. We have a timeline with a little blue slice on the bottom indicating the year. So I want to show you, you can get amazing ads. If you are a tour guide, journalist, whatever, newspapers.com, you can find such great information. So this is an ad for a Hawaiian pizza in 1966, just to show you that by 1966, Round Table, which is a big West Coast chain, Round Table was making a Hawaiian pizza. It's in the public knowledge. 1966. Okay, great. We're setting this up. And you can even see that, I think it says over here, yeah, it says pineapple and tender smoked ham. Great. Because it's important to me that the word or the phrase Hawaiian pizza, that we can match that up with a description of what it even is. Because as you'll see in a few minutes, it doesn't always mean the same thing. Next, I want to bring it back a little bit earlier to 1963, where we have a pizza that has Italian ham, which, is it a prosciutto? We don't know really, and the pineapple. Great, wonderful. We see it in 1963, which, by the way, is just 1 year after the alleged creation. And we have to give major credit. Sam Panopoulos, served this pizza in Canada, allegedly naming it after the brand of canned pineapple he was using, which is called Hawaiian. And by the 1960s, lots of pineapples being grown in Hawaii. It's worth saying right now that currently very, very few pineapples are grown in Hawaii, and it's not a fruit that's indigenous to Hawaii. It's a fruit that became common in Hawaii. I mean, the journey of the pineapple is interesting. It starts off in South America. Spanish conquistadors bring it to Europe, and then they end up bringing it back to places like Hawaii where it's being grown. And that's why we have this big association of pineapple with Hawaii, late 1800s into the mid 1900s, big association. And Sam Panopoulos, I'm sure, put this on as to see what would happen, and then there it is. His is the story that always gets retold. And not to take anything from that story, when you go back a little further, there are Hawaiian pizzas. And I'm showing you a 1959 ad. I'm sorry, it's a recipe. And this is a recipe that was published in papers across the country. And it's for Hawaiian pizza that's a dessert pizza. So it's not the savory pineapple and ham, but it is called a Hawaiian pizza. And there's a picture right in this paper. It's unbelievable. So just to establish that there is such a thing as a Hawaiian pizza prior to 1952, but what we're really looking for are savory pizzas. This is an ad from 1957. I've split it up just so you can see it on one screen, but it was a long ad from a place in Portland, Oregon called Pizza Jungle. And they had, you got to look at these pizzas. They had a different specialty pizza for a Hungarian one, an Alaskan one, a Chinese one. I mean, these are all wild. To say that pizza is being bastardized in 2024 because of TikTokers doing crazy things with pizza, you're ignoring our past. In the 1950s, when Americans discovered pizza really on a large scale, we were immediately doing weird things to it. Like you can get a hot dog pizza, which is very popular in Naples right now. But in America at that time, we were doing it. Weird. But this is a savory pizza. However, the pineapple, or rather the Hawaiian pizza that's in the center column, second from the top, it's a pineapple, papaya, and green pepper. No ham. Fine. The earliest that we see something closer to this, that or at least that I've seen, is a 1956 recipe for a savory Hawaiian pizza, which is really funny. It's an English muffin pizza. So this is not in a restaurant. It's an English muffin with sausage and pineapple. So as far as I've seen, this is the earliest reference to it. So, anytime you want to get upset, this is one that was published in a few places, but I pulled this one from the Hartford Current, Hartford, Connecticut. Don't hate the player or the game. It's just, I just want to let you know that this is stuff we've been experimenting with pizza since we figured out what it was. In the United States, that was the 1950s. So I want to track it back just ever so slightly because there's some other kind of cool stuff. I had a bunch of German tourists on my tour a couple of weeks ago, and we were talking about how there's a similar dish that became popular in Germany in the mid 50s called Toast Hawaii. That's a piece of bread with ham, pineapple, and a maraschino sherry, which is very important to them. I would not call this a pizza, but certainly a precursor, the same flavor profile because it's the same ingredients. But there's something even earlier than this, and I've been trying to get my hands on a copy. I haven't yet. I've been working with the Hormel archivists to find a physical copy of this book. This is a 1939 pamphlet it's called Hormel Invites You to Dine. And 2 years prior to this, they came out with a product called Spam. And in this, it's not even a recipe book. It's just here's fun ways to use our stuff. And they have this thing called a grilled spamwich, which is buttered toast with grated cheese, pineapple, and ham. So that combination certainly exists as far back as 1939. Lands on a pizza sometime in the 50s, and then becomes more popular in the 60s. And then now, like it or not, it's extremely popular. And it exists in New York, even though we New Yorkers maybe don't want to admit that. So before we jump into a Q&A session where I'm going to bring on Stephanie and Peter in about 90 seconds, There's one quick bonus myth, very, very quick bonus myth. And this is the myth of who invented the stuffed crust pizza. Very quick. Pizza Hut launched the stuffed crust pizza in the mid 90s, but it goes a little deeper than this story. There are stuffed crust pizzas in Italy back to the 1940s. There are people who claim to have made them in the United States in the 1960s, but there's only one person who had a patent on a method for making stuffed crust pizza, and his name is Anthony Mangello. And he has a patent from 1987. And this is a shameless plug, I'm going to be interviewing Anthony Mangello at the Center for Brooklyn History a week from today, October 16th, 6:30 p.m. It's a live event. I'll be doing a conversation with Anthony where we'll be talking about his process, what happened, and why he sued Pizza Hut for $1 billion for stealing his plan. And that story and more will happen next week. We're going to have stuffed crust pizza provided by Norm's in downtown Brooklyn. And we're going to be stuffing the crust with Polly-O string cheese, which, by the way, was I don't want to say invented, but like presented to Polly-O by Anthony Mangello's father. So the story gets deeper. Anyway, just a quick plug. You can scan the code, you can register, it's free tickets, but we want to get a registration so we get enough pizza. And before I bring on our special guest for a Q&A, I want to pop this up on your screen. It's 3 QR codes. One is from my website. In case you're ever interested, you need to get in touch with me. You can do it through the website. We do tours. That's what we do. GANYC's website is on the left. Guides Association of New York City. If you're looking for a guide, go there. Licensed guides who care. They care enough that they show up to meetings and do self-education. Amazing organization. I'll be at the meeting tonight doing a very short version of this for the group. And all the way to the right, I've given you a code that'll get you to a PDF that's sitting on a Google Drive of the bullet points of this presentation. It's a 2-page PDF, just giving you bullet points. If you're interested, I'll probably also be emailing you a copy of this. And I'll also email you a much less beautiful presentation of like a list of information, basically, about all the stuff we've talked about with sources and more text. But I want to make sure you have that QR code on the right that gets you to the fact sheet. And so I'm going to bring on Peter Regis, and I'm also going to bring on Stephanie Swan. So if you are Peter or Stephanie, you'll notice that I'm promoting you to be a panelist right now. And for everybody else, if you have any questions, please drop them in the Q&A section. I see a few in here right now. So we're going to go over these. And first, I'll get Mr. Peter Regis right over here. Ladies and gentlemen, Peter Regis, what are you up to right now, my friend?
I'm just watching a fabulous presentation. Thanks, Scott.
Well, thank you. It's so some backstory is for those of us who spend our time researching pizza, it became a lot more fun when we found the other people who were doing it too. And so when Peter and I first connected, it was beautiful, and you should see our text chains. They would either be horrifying or wonderful to you too. And Stephanie Swan, welcome to you. Stephanie is a publisher of the Modernist books and spent years doing Modernist pizza. And even though that book is out in the wild, she still is a cornerstone of the pizza world, represents an organization called Women in Pizza, which promotes women in the pizza business, it's such a male-dominated business, but there are lots of women who are involved with it. So Stephanie does tons of things with pizza, and we see her at all these events. So Stephanie, thanks for jumping in. Let's go down this list. I have not been looking at this Q&A yet, but right now, okay. From the bottom, I see, okay. There's someone, E.T. Rodriguez asked, do you happen to know the oldest pizzerias in each borough? Peter or Stephanie, any thoughts on the oldest in each borough?
Well, we think we know the oldest known pizzerias in each borough. Do we want to go down the list? I don't have at my fingertips the Bronx, but uh, surely Manhattan, which you talked about, Scott, John Albano. I don't remember that you referred to this, but it's important for Albano. I've sort of changed my opinion since we last talked about this.
Wait, but
Yeah,
Peter, only want to pause you for a second because I not necessarily the first, but the oldest, and I'm assuming from that means currently existing, surviving
right.
oldest.
So this gets into the wording of it, which is extremely hard to be precise with because it can always, I mean, it's so complicated because with the Albano example in particular, what do you say when he established the business? Was it in Manhattan? Was it when we know he had a pizzeria, or the year before when we know he was there as a baker, but it didn't say pizzeria? Or we for sure, well, almost certainly know that he had a pizzeria in Naples even before 1890. So did that establish the business, and is it the same business? So it gets into location, ownership, what proof we actually have. So this is why the wording of things is difficult at times. But the bottom line is you were absolutely right. 1894 is when we first know, but I've changed my mind on this, Scott. I think the better, more consistent way to say it is that if we're going to claim that Maloney established Spring Street's Pizzeria in 1898 or 99, I think 1898 is a better example. Using that standard, we probably should say Albano started the pizzeria in 1893. And that's because we know he was a pizza maker and owner before and afterwards. And we know he was there at a spot that was in the year later, a pizzeria. So it's pretty, it's not certain, but it's almost certain. So that's my standard of proof.
I want to give everybody some clarity because it's a name that I hadn't dropped before. So John Albano, when I showed you that 1894 listing, John Albano was the owner of that restaurant. And his name, you can follow him around the city as a baker, as a pizza maker. So that's, to give you the context, that's the 1894 guy. But the reason that I had mentioned 1894 is because that's when we see for absolute sure that's a year, that's a thing. There's a strong, like when we talk about this, Stephanie and Peter and I and Colin and everybody else, I think we tend to talk in like percentage certainty, and how percentage of certainty that it was 1893 is probably up pretty high, but percentage of certainty of 1894 is, it's like we see it right there, it's 100. So, but what about the oldest currently surviving, existing? And I know that this gets murky. Is it the same location? Is it the same family, the same name? Let's pick one definition and go for it.
I think
Stephanie,
it's
what
John's.
definition should we use? Okay, John's. That's Manhattan.
Yeah, I would say John's. But so we're saying consistently running, because that's the other piece too, is that sometimes the pizzeria may close for a specific time frame and then reopen again,
I think
maybe in
if
the
the
same
business is
location,
still, if the business is still active, like Totono's,
still
in the
serving
case of
pizza.
Totono's, yeah, like Totono's has been inactive but still existing through the fire and the floods and everything. So
And just to throw a wrench in it too, I mean, do we say that John started at Sullivan Street, and then it was started by Maloney? And then if it was started by Maloney, why do we pick that year? Why don't we pick his first known year in America that he started one, which would be 1897? So this gets into,
And not in that location.
right, but that's not
yeah,
in our plan because he always changed too. So if we're going to go back
Right.
to Sullivan Street, why not go back to Brooklyn, which is where the first known pizzeria that Maloney had? So
yeah.
anyway, my bottom line on this whole thing, and it's fun to talk about, but whatever the standard is, one, it should make sense, and two, more to the point, we should be consistent. So if we're going to have one rule for Maloney, we should have the same rule for Albano. Everyone's the same.
I think of it in terms of, if the years butt up and they move, for instance, which gets tricky because Pizzeria Newport Alba stays at 51 McDougal even though John moves. So it's like, well, is this a branch when he moved to Bleecker? Is that the new establishment year? And if so, how are you still getting it wrong, saying 29 instead of 38 or 39? It's just a lot of, there's murkiness. And but I do think that if we're saying currently existing oldest in the Bronx, there's not a place older than Mario's, even though they're not just a pizzeria. I mean, currently existing, wouldn't you say?
Well, that's another thing, right? So it's it's complicated, right? But I think the larger point is, Scott, is that and I think this is inherently with people who write like we do, or tour guides, we're biased towards stories. And that's understandable because that's the way people think in terms of stories. And my one big thing today is just make sure you don't get carried away with that story, because it's just like intoxicated. Like, you really have to ask, how do we know? For
That's
everything.
why. That's
Even,
why I
I mean,
get.
especially us too. Like, how do I know that? Like, what proof do you actually have? And not just, it was in the New York Times, it was in a book, whatever. He's a really good artist. So she's a fantastic researcher. So what? In the end, it doesn't matter. You need to show your work. Where did it come from? And to trace that back to the original sources. That's the ground truth. And not just that. I mean, here's an example. You showed that one 1907 ad that Lombardi's had, or at least the pizzeria that was there before Lombardi, and had the two proprietors, it said on the ad. Well, when you dig a little deeper, even though that's a primary source, they really weren't proprietors. So
Yeah.
they were there at the time as managers, as workers, and and Santillo at that time was going back to Italy, and then he came back the next year. Blah blah blah. So what? But it's just an example of how you need to be extremely careful. And the gold standard is multiple independent primary sources, and that's why we work so hard on this, because the truth is elusive, and you really have to get as much as you can, and you still may not know. So.
Stephanie, I just want to ask you about this, because like you're publishing books about this. How do you approach the concept of word choice?
Well, it's a tricky subject, definitely, because like Peter mentioned, there's always going to be information that we're finding sources after we're published. And so we do try to keep things open as far as if there's a source that we can cite at that time. And I know both Peter and yourself, Scott, were great with helping us find research, and we had other researchers in the city as well working for us. We're targeting a deadline, and that's our date to whatever we can find by that time. And that's what we're publishing. But we're also very cognizant of word choice, saying that, this is what we know as of today. It doesn't mean that the day after we publish, Peter doesn't unearth some other information on Chicago that we may not have known about, or that we finally find a photograph pre-1950s of pizza in any of these pizzerias, or an example of flour mills and what flour is now being found in this country in the 1900s. So you have to keep it to what you know and in the moment. And then also be able to say, there are other people doing this work too. If this is information that you know of that you can share, as well as have factual information, then that's fantastic. Bring it forward.
So another question came up over here from Arthur Bovino, who has lots of great questions all the time. And it's a question about L&B Spumoni Gardens, which we didn't talk about at all, but L&B Spumoni Gardens is the place that notoriously began as a ice cream business. And Arthur's really asking about, there's discrepancy between some article I read and then the story on their website and all that. I'm like kind of obsessed with the history of that. Have you guys looked much into their transition from ice cream to pizza in the 50s?
We haven't.
Peter's smiling.
Well, I've told you everything I know about them. So, but
yeah,
that's a priority, but not a high priority for me.
I hear you. I love it because people ask about L&B all the time. If you haven't been, it's on 86th Street in Gravesend. Famous for the Sicilian pizza with the sauce on top. So the answer is it was an ice cream business. He lived around the corner. Ludovico Barbati is the name of the founder, L&B, Ludovico Barbati, and that his son-in-law owned a pizzeria, or at least it's in his son-in-law's name. And then he, in 1952 is the first year of listing in the business directories, and in 53, Ludovico Barbati's name appears on it. So L&B probably was not serving pizza until the early 50s. It's that's about the extent of what I know. I hope that helps, Arthur. Okay, here's another one. Oh, Peter, this one, the question that came up from William Goodhart is, where did Chicago deep dish pizza come from? And you should definitely let them know where you can find a very intense article that you've written about this, and then you should definitely give a quick answer.
Quick answer is my article came out in Chicago Magazine over the summer of this year. So just do Peter Regas deep dish pizza Chicago, and it should be at the top of the list. The short answer is it came from the pizzeria that became Pizzeria Uno in December of 1943, originally owned by a man named Rick Ricardo, who was an Italian immigrant. And the development of the pizza sort of, and the point of the article is that it came in stages. Like a lot of these pizzas, I think it's a good point to make in general. We say this started here, and what started there, and did it just like start and then it didn't change at all, or it sort of evolved, or it changed throughout time depending on who the bakers were, the ovens, blah blah blah. So this deep dish pizza concept was invented probably in 43, 44. And it wasn't that thick, it wasn't that heavy, it was high in fat and high in sugar, but it was not as nearly as intense of a product that is sold now. So it changed throughout the decades, and some of the significant changes is they had an African-American cook by the name of Alice May Redmond. And the legend and the lore and my interviews with her daughter confirmed that she substituted her biscuit recipe from her mother in the South for the crust and made a high-fat dough, super high fat. I mean, we're talking 40 plus bakers percent of fat. And the fat of choice was olive oil at the time. And so that's how it got started. And then people loved the crust, and they apparently in the 60s wanted more of it, and they gave them what they wanted. And so we have this dish now that is super high in fat and extremely thick and extremely caloric. And so that's the short history of it.
It's fascinating because like what we think of as deep dish pizza today is, as Peter said, is very different from what it was at its starting point, which is why like, well, how did it begin? It's like, well, it didn't really begin at the beginning. Like at what point is it being called deep dish? At what point, what is deep? What is it? This, is it this, is it this? Is it? So these are all just words, and food words change their meaning over time. And but that's why it's interesting stuff. I want to answer this one really fast. Hey Jess, I know Jess, asked this question about, is there a Pizza Hall of Fame noting other trailblazers, like Black-owned pizzerias, women-owned pizzerias, all that? PMQ Magazine, which I have a copy somewhere near me, has a back page that they call Pizza Hall of Fame. Maybe Stephanie, you've got some. And that back page, there you go. The back page of the magazine always has a Pizza Hall of Fame, like a 50-year-old plus place that they feature. And it's like, yeah, there you go, Stephanie, this is amazing. So that's one place for it. There's no physical Hall of Fame. It's a virtual thing. But if you're interested in that kind of thing, it's social media is where that stuff happens.
But there's also inaccuracies from the Pizza Hall of Fame too. So you have to take it with a grain of salt, because they are also plaques that have Pizza Hall of Fame on them that both of us will dispute. But that's what happens when the information wasn't really fact checked and it was believed as marketing. hearsay. So, I mean, there's a variety of plaques in Chicago. There's a variety of plaques in New York that are inaccurate.
Yeah, it's tough because it's coming from like a trade magazine is not a research journal. So, but it's still like that's where some recognition is happening at least. Here's a great question that came up over here about when did we start putting tomato on pizza, and do we know why?
In the US or the
I
world?
think we can say the world. That's Roger's question, and I'm interpreting that as the world. I guess my knowledge is the earliest. So there's a bunch of references to tomato being on pizza in like, I forgot, there's like an insane, like 1734, but no documentation showing that year. And, any writing that we see about it there's not a lot of writing until the early 19th century.
Well, tomatoes
So,
weren't even in Italy until after the 16th century, let alone were they something that people desired until later as far as consumption. So, you have to trace back to the origin of the tomato coming from Mesoamerica, most likely, and then how it dispersed, and then how it was consumed, and why it was consumed. And it was also inexpensive and something that was more considered a treat early on. So it wasn't something that you would add as a topping to most places that were creating pizza, because pizza was the food of the poor. And so, oil and whatever was available, like small fishes, for example, was probably what was used early on in Italy, not something as grandeur as a tomato. And it was highly available. And fish, obviously in Naples, small fish, alici, were very, very viable. And a lot of fishermen were coming into the port and grabbing pizza or pizza-like things to consume on their trips, because it was also something that you could keep for a while, which tomato you couldn't necessarily keep, or other vegetables, they would expire on food.
Peter, any other thoughts about like early documentation, specifically about tomato landing on pizzas?
Well, I think the thing that I'm always fascinated by, because it's so beautiful, is the lithography that was in Naples from about 1800 to 1850, which is just spectacular because we have color and they're beautiful. And they do show shredded tomatoes on top of what look like pizzas. And so that's the first indication that I know of. I think some of these actually date from the 1810s. So, but it's an interesting question. The tomato to me is sort of a loaded topic a little bit, because we sort of assume it was there close to the very beginning, which I think Stephanie was onto something there with fish being, I think, a big clue. I can't prove it, but my bones say that the marriage of the protein of fish and the carb of a crust and some fat was sort of the killer combination. And there's something about a port city that is also fascinating to me, because it brings together so many cultures and people are moving around. So it's that's where I think the juice is. That's where the good stuff is. But again, I can't prove that. So I'd be the first one to say that, we need to be careful about this. But there is, I mean, to back up even further then, so I mean, I think the importance of the tomato is we can ask a question. If we didn't have that combination of crust, cheese, and tomato, would pizza be pizza? I don't think so. I think that's the magic. And I think if you don't have that, I think someone in here said, what's the definition of a pizza? Well, that's just totally a loaded question. But to me, in my bones, if you were to hold me down, you got to have a tomato on it. And I know that's wrong, but yeah, you have to have tomato on a crust. For me to think it's a pizza, again, that's just a personal opinion. But if I don't have a tomato on my pizza, it's something else to me. But anyway, so I'll stop there.
I'll just bring up some of that lithography that Peter's talking about. that this is what you're talking about. I mean, there's beautiful images from the mid 19th century, and they all say right on the bottom, pizza vendor, pizza maker, pizza person, and they're all selling pizza from the streets. So some of the information we get it's hard. You can't tell what are the ingredients in this thing that's an image. So there's a couple things that are in the chat that I want to like blow through super fast. One of them is, are the other Patsy's restaurants related to the original? And the one in East Harlem is the original. The other ones are franchises. So they are related, but it's a business partnership. And I don't think any of the other ones have coal-fired ovens, from what I know. And they're all different. Like I think of the one in East Harlem as being different. Like when I've gone to one and the other back to back, and they're just different animals. So I hope that one answers that question. And then there's another good question in here that'll open to all of us. This is from Ian McCallan. So Ian, I think I put his website up before. He wrote a book called Red Sauce, and it's all about Italian food in America and becoming Italian American food. Really great book. And he's asking, have you looked into, there's a pizzeria in Naples called Lombardi. Have you looked into Lombardi 1892 in Naples and the possibility of that family being connected to the New York Lombardi, which is what they claim? So I know I've looked into it and I have not seen any connection. Stephanie and Peter, have you seen any actual connections?
Same. No, I visited the Lombardi 1992 a couple of times and reviewed their archives, what they have, and couldn't find any true connection or early pizza photographs either.
Which brings up another good question that came up. What's the oldest actual photo of a pizza in the US? And what's the oldest in Italy?
I can answer that. I think to break it into two things, one, the oldest dated one is 1928. And I don't know if you have that photo available, Scott, but it's the pizza boys in front of a bakery during an Italian feast day in Upper East Side Italian Harlem.
Here's a zoom in of it. It's not in context, but it's a bunch of boys. Yeah.
With some very dry looking
at a festival.
Piles of pizza.
Yeah. And then, but what we think might have been an even older one, and this is a little bit of speculation, but Colin, in his dealings with Frank Pepe's family, has a very young looking Frank Pepe. And if we kind of assume it was taken on or near the day he opened, that might be the earliest one. Now that looks to be, I don't know if you had that photo, but it's a very souped up pizza with a lot of toppings and a lot of
it's got the fish coming in.
It's got a lot of on it. So it's made for publicity. I somehow doubt that it were actually serving that, but who knows? But those are the two oldest. So about 1925 and 1928. It's a little odd, I guess, that, with now photos are so ubiquitous that we don't have something even earlier than that, but that's all we got. But we're still
But I
trying.
think too, Peter, like you mentioned about celebration, most of the photos that we would find of these earlier pizzerias didn't include pizza. They included other things like families together or celebrating with a cake or, but pizza was never a part of the photograph. And for some reason, they didn't feel like it was special enough to take pictures of in a lot of these early pizzerias.
I'm trying to find you that picture, but if anybody's curious about it, I'm sure if you look up Frank Pepe, isn't it the one where he's going like this?
Mm-hmm.
No, it's the actual one where he has it in front of him.
Oh, yeah. Okay, where he's holding
like this.
It. Yeah. Like on a box or something. Here is, okay, let's see. Sally's in New Haven. We'll stick to New Haven. Sally's in New Haven used to be our favorite, but the company changed hands and opened other branches. It seems to have changed. Am I missing something? Okay, well, this is like a definitely a subjective question. Sally's was one place on Worcester Street, notorious for having challenging service and a bathroom that wasn't on a cleaning schedule. That's the gentlest way I can say this. And then maybe 3 years ago, yeah, the company was purchased and now they're opening other ones. Anytime that happens, there's the to stay alive, it has to change. So I'm not ever going to complain about the fact that the bathroom's clean now, that the service is good. But yeah, I think this is just the answer here is things change. Here's a good one over here. New York, New Haven, and Jersey pizza, fairly well documented. But what about Philly and Boston pizza history? I will say real quickly before I know we jump into everything, Boston does have a pretty decently documented pizza history. And some of the earliest ones that I know of were people who were first in New York and then went to Boston because New York had too many pizzerias. I'm thinking about Parziale's, which is still a bakery still open. And there's a great article from 1958, I want to say, where they're interviewed saying, "Oh, we left New York in 1907 because there were too many pizzerias and we came up here." So that's kind of cool. But what do you guys think? Boston and Philly?
Well, it might be a good spot here to say that before 1900, there's 6 confirmed U.S. pizzerias that were in existence at one time or another. So from about 1890 to 1900, we've identified 6 known pizzerias in the United States, and there was one in Boston. And real quick in my mind, there was the rest of them were all in either Brooklyn or Manhattan. So
Cool. I don't know all those, so I got to check in with you about some of those, especially the Boston one. I don't know. The it's also worth saying that it's unlikely that there weren't more pizzerias before 1900. But again, this is just the like we only know about it if we find a shred of paper that says it. So
right. So this gets into another definition as to what we actually consider to be a pizzeria. If a bakery existed that was
yeah,
a bread bakery, and then on Fridays with their dough after 8, they made sheet pizzas in pans, is that a pizzeria? Yes, it is. But we should make a distinction between the two, because just because you have an oven and you're an Italian baker and you're making sheet pizza is not quite what we're looking for when we're talking about a dedicated pizzeria business. So I've tried to make the distinction between the two. And that brings up another point, which we didn't touch on, is that one of the things within your history that has come out, we used to believe, and there is some basis for this belief, that the pizzeria industry evolved from bakeries that were bread bakers, right? While that could be true, certainly in some cases, what the Albano example and possibly the Maloney example and some other bakers from particularly New York City give a description. For example, Maloney, there is no evidence at all that he was ever baking bread as a primary source of baking. It was always pizza. So they are 2 examples that really sit in tension with the hypothesis at one time that this generally came from bread bakers, and that's how we established a pizzeria business. In fact, when we look really closely at this, it may be the case that pizza makers, and in fact, in the Albano case, it is true, came from Naples as pizza bakers and opened up shop in New York from the get-go. And so, you know, one of the exciting things is that when you go back far enough, individuals can actually change history, and little discrepancies in stories can have big effects if they come early enough. And so this is part of the exciting worth of doing all this work through all these years of finding these things and figuring out that, you know what we thought we really believed is not really the case, or at least substantial doubt as to whether it occurred the way we actually thought it was. Now, in some cities, there's no doubt it probably did come from the bakers. And when pizza became popular, particularly in the 30s, then these people thought, hey, there's this new market here. We're already baking bread. We already have the dough. Let's make pizza from it. So again, we need to be careful as to when we're talking, where we're talking. But at the very beginning, at least, there are examples of actual pizza makers from Naples coming over and making pizza as a primary product.
Scott, I just wanted to go back to the question about tomatoes because I wanted to pull up a couple just research things that I had at my disposal. In 1704, it looks like the tomato is finally being introduced into cookbooks in Italian, and then followed up in 1958. The Art of Cookery is also starting to add tomatoes to recipes, which is a early UK publication. So I'd say like on the cusp of just the cookery side from Italy and the UK, it's really not until the 1700s where you see him being used within recipes, not pizza, just recipes in general.
Mm. I remember reading about a 1692 or 1693 tomato sauce that was something like a Spanish sauce for steak.
Yes, Spain was the leader of using tomatoes. They were already, 1624 is Scalco a la Moderna, which was the Spanish sauce in 1624.
Wow, 24,
Mm.
early. Speaking of which, I see a message from Ian McCallan talking in the Q&A, talking about tomatoes, and then he also goes into something interesting that we didn't say explicitly, but we should mention now. He just mentions about the term pizza itself, and he points out that before it meant the thing that we use it for today, the crust, sauce, cheese, whatever, is that the term pizza was like a general term for pastry, cookies, cakes, like every recipe that used that word pizza was there was nothing too consistent, but they were all sweet. A lot of them were
like pizza
like almond
napolitana
flour.
in the 1600s was
Yeah.
a sweet, not necessarily what we would consider pizza today.
Yeah, and I think for this conversation, I sort of ignore that use of the word, and that's why I think of just like with Hawaiian pizza. It's like, well, when is the term? When does that pair up with the recipe? And like that's really the food that we're talking about. But it's amazing that word, you get excited if you see the word, and like, what was it? Oh, or even the image, the fresco found at Pompeii. Oh, an image of something round with stuff on it, and people freak out. Pizza's the first thing you think of, and that's why, since pizza has become such a universal food and it's so common, we don't think of it having any deeper detail or story, and certainly don't think of it as being a food that requires or maybe even deserves to be thought of in a deeper way. And it has been ever since, I mean, Evelyn Sloman wrote a book called The Pizza Book in the 80s that really talked about pizza as a cultural element. Ed Levine, his book came out, Pizza Slice of Heaven, in 2004. And then now suddenly everybody thinks of pizza as this cultural element. And so the questions that remain in the Q&A, a lot of them really refer to some of the like deeper minutia kind of stuff, which I know we all really love. But I also know that we've had you guys here for a long time, and I don't want to push anybody too deep. But John, you think we can hang another 5 minutes? What's your thought on timing?
We can hang for a little bit longer. I'm good if people are. Obviously, I'm sure audience may be able to. Audience is obviously free to leave when they want, but this is being recorded, so we can. Could I just make a comment briefly? Because I really have. I mean, this has just been awesome, and I think Scott, your presentation is great, but also just this chat among the three of you, all talking about areas of your expertise, is just incredible. And you really touched on something that hit a nerve with me about using primary sources, because I think that's so essential to ground. And I think as tour guides, we don't always have time to actually go into archives and look at primary sources on top of every topic we talk about, but we should be using sources that are grounded in primary sources, if at least. That's one thing. But another thing you mentioned is like, this frustration with articles by the New York Times, and I've had this with, I do like one common myth that I have to bust sometimes is the myth that Abraham Lincoln drank at McSorley's, and I apologize if anybody still wants to believe that, but it's just very unlikely that that's true. And the very difficult thing about that is that if you are vested in trying to prove that that is true, you could probably Google and find a newspaper article by the New York Times and written at some point. And how do you say that that's and of course what we have, that what you have to look at is that, okay, well, what kind of article is this? Is this an article by somebody who's actually witnessing the current events that they're reporting on, or is this, an article about something that's a little bit trivial from the author's point of view, and so on. And I think that unfortunately, sometimes you'll see articles like that in otherwise very respectable news sources that are, just not grounded in expertise. The author is not an expert on what they're talking about, and so on. And I think that comes up a lot in the kind of research that you guys do and many of us do. So that's always a warning, is that, yes, I don't want to discourage people from relying on, on media sources for many topics, but that you have to verify everything. And like I said, primary source is really key. But yes, let's keep going. I'm enjoying this.
Well,
But even in
just on
books too, I think that that's the other thing is I'm sure, Peter and Scott, myself, we've researched books and you find books that don't have the author has cited something, but then when you go back to the author and ask for their citations where they got to this point, whatever, and they ghost you. I'm sure I know it's happened to me many times and Peter and Scott too. So, you're trying to do the best you can. And I think that that's where you have to draw the line too, is if you can't find the information, then you have to leave it as it's probable, but it's not necessarily factual. And leave it with a
Yeah.
big question mark.
It's really like, I mean, this is exactly why I started asking GANYC a few months ago if I could do this. Because I mean, I do tours that give this information all the time, but it's really important to me that, like, when I walk past and I hear a tour guide saying something, I don't expect that they would know the minutia of John Albano or something like that. But you can't stop and say, oh, hey, come here. Let me actually just give you this information that's so esoteric that, like, it's no, like, that's why I love the idea of, like, going to experts. And, like, all of us research this stuff constantly, but we're talking to each other all the time about it because of, how deep it all gets. But that's why, yeah, the sources that we look for. And actually, I learned a lot from Peter, because when I was starting doing research, when I started my tours, 2008, a lot of the research was confirmation research. I was just, oh, it says that this exists and there's a document. I just got to find that thing. And when I didn't find the thing, my thought was, oh, it got lost in must have been a fire somewhere. I didn't realize that, no, wait a second, you can keep looking and there's information that's not there. Oral history is great to start the research. It's best. But if somebody gives you 10 facts in their oral history, if even one of them leads you to a place of finding an actual fact, that's so worth it. So great.
Can
So
I say one thing on that? I think the thing that I've learned from doing this for 15 years is that while family stories are critically important, if you don't have the documentation from the time, the period that they're talking, you're lost, because I would say probably the majority of the family stories were fatally flawed. I mean, seriously, deeply flawed. And it wasn't like they were lying all the time, or even most of the time. I think they were being as truthful as they could be. But what was happening is they were repeating a story that they got from their parents, and it always suspiciously had grandfather as the hero of the story and as the guy who started it, and a lot of conflation. And in fact, if you go back to the Lombardi story, I think if I had to guess, I think the problem with that story started with is that he started at the pizzeria as a worker there, probably, and I don't know this, but probably as a worker there, and it got conflated with the story that he owned it at that time, and then it became a huge thing. So, and in fact, on that note, Scott, if I could make two small corrections as your excellent presentations. One, that ad of Scintilla was actually from 05, not 04. It started in 04, and that's significant because the ads started to run in August of 04, and that was before Lombardi was even in America. So we know 100% for sure that it was a pizzeria owned by Santillo before Lombardi was even here. And the second thing, I don't have any evidence that Maloney partnered with John Sasso. My best guess is that he bought the business from Maloney and that he partnered with Pasquale Delagucci. So that's just a small thing.
Yeah.
And we probably guess, or at least I guess, that probably happened somewhere between 1922 and 23. And so always
Yeah.
being ultra careful on these
Yeah,
things.
I make an assumption of that only because I think I had seen their names listed together, but that always could be, their names are also listed together at some point after Maloney had died. So that's, oh,
Yeah.
we know that's a flaw. And Peter mentioned Pasquale del Giudici and his wife Anna, who lived at 175 Sullivan Street and then ended up owning a pizzeria called, I think, Pizzeria Newport Alba.
Yeah. Then we start the
So
new stuff. Right. Right.
in the, I mean, just to, the whole New York lore of like famous Rays, original Rays, all that, like it's the same story happened much earlier with Port Alba. There was original Port Alba, new Port Alba,
Right. And they're
Pizzeria
an
Port
excellent
Alba.
example too, because they didn't have any kids, like Maloney did not have any kids, and they were forgotten about until
Yeah.
these directories were rediscovered and we know who they were now. But until genealogy that you could do on an easy sort of mass basis that only occurred in the last 2 decades, it was really sort of an untractable problem to think, oh yeah, I'll just go in and I'll do 100 Italian families in a year. And, no, you're not going to do that. So I cut people an enormous slack who did articles before, say, 20 years ago, because a lot of this stuff was just hard to get to. Now, the one thing that they could have done is gone to city directories, which they didn't do. But anyway, so there's another thing. I don't know if I see the same questions that you do. I've seen the Dorico example up there, and I've seen Steve Dolinsky had a question too.
Yeah, I was going to ask you if you could do that. It's Steve's question.
So Steve's question was, I believe, on distinguishing stuffed pizza from pan pizza from deep dish pizza. And the way I generally like to think of it is that what we call deep dish pizza became popular in the 60s in Chicago and became super popular, like almost a crazy popular in the early 70s. And once that started to happen, people saw dollar signs and they started to think if they could make it even thicker, can they put stuffed in it? Isn't there an old stuffed pizza from Italy that they can use of? But the primary basis of what they were going after is this heavier pizza that was made in a pan in Chicago. So it sort of comes off the same tree in terms of the trend and the phenomena, with different points of origin actually, but stuffed sort of came from pan pizza, which is what was being made at Pizzeria Uno. And now you can distinguish it with stuffed being a layer on the bottom, a filling, and a second crust on top, and then sauce on top of that. And pan pizza, it's a little bit ambiguous, but basically I think of it is that it's not the super high fat in the crust that deep dish now has. So again, that's the distinguishing thing between the three different styles. But they're all in of themselves popular with their segments. And the interesting thing to me is that deep dish with the super high fat crust, you could make a case that that's not the avant-garde anymore. Certainly that the newer ones that are becoming popular with the polling in the media are sort of the more pan type of pizzas, like the Pequods type of pizzas, if you know that name. So that's all I got on that subject.
It's fascinating because it's like it's a conversation about terminology and about like at what point are there so enough examples of a process that it teams up with a term that's
We can say a
different.
style, which
Yeah.
monitors got into in a big way. So yeah.
Well, like the example I always think of is Detroit style is very popular right now, but there were very few places that were making pizza that way. And then suddenly when there are enough, and it's got enough differentiation from other things, well, now suddenly it earns this term that's assigned to it from the outside, not from people in Detroit. Or, it's the same kind of thing with, like, I think of, I saw an article or a post or something this morning about grandma and Sicilian, equating them as being the same thing, when your Sicilian grandma might make a pizza one way, but that doesn't mean that that's what, like, the common use of the term is, that a Sicilian is puffy. The way that we usually use that term, the dough is allowed to rise in the pan before it bakes, and a grandma, the dough is not allowed to rise in the pan before it bakes, and therefore you have a Sicilian and a grandma. It's just like the use of the term being different. And if people start confusing those terms, then the terms will change their meaning, which is fine. We follow word use. We don't direct it.
Scott, I wanted to go back to about the question about Boston. There was a 1903 article in the Boston Journal talking about a pizzeria in Boston serving pizza Gavoy on North Street. So that's definitely one that was an early pizza reference. I think, Peter, you probably have seen that one too, the pizza Gavoy.
Right. That's a
Yeah, that was
problem.
printed a bunch of times.
Right. Right. A bunch of times, and it's problematic because it was changed a bunch of times.
Yeah.
So it's never clear who the author was. And
Mhm.
while they say Boston, I believe it was originally Boston, it's suspiciously like Spring Street at that time. So there's conflation between the two articles that, unfortunately, we can't go back in time and say, we want the perfect article. I mean, I found
Yes.
the earliest ad in Chicago of a pizzeria has the wrong address. It didn't exist. So is it a wrong ad? Well, no, it's still a right ad. They just screwed up the address, which is just incredible to think about. But you have one job, just say the right address, but they got that wrong. Yeah. So a lot of these papers that have the best stuff were not the highest quality newspapers. Were understandable at the time. Like they probably had a circulation in the thousands, if that, probably in the hundreds, for all I know. So,
Yeah.
but yeah. So, more questions.
Really quickly, I want to go through and blast a couple of them out, and then there's only maybe two more that I really want to sit on. I know, by the way, that there's a great question from John Arena, great pizza maker whose family was on Spring Street, and now he's in Las Vegas. A great question from Karen Dybus, who wrote the Detroit Pizza book, and also, and also I wanted to mention, and Armand DeRico is in here asking questions, whose family owned the pizzeria at 53 Spring Street after and before Lombardi. But anyway, real quickly, after and before. Real quickly, so there was a question about when was 00 flour invented. Super fast answer is the scale 0001 2 integrale is a scale of how much extraction of the wheat when you're milling flour. So if you mill flour and you don't sift it, it's integrale, it's whole grain. And then the more you sift out, the lower that number gets. And I think that Italy put in those numbers in the 60s. I think it was in 66 or 67. I'll have to double check on it, but it's like, that's a term that started to be used it wasn't until the 60s. So it's not a flour that existed in the 19th century. And so if anybody is required to use that kind of flour, it's not a historical basis, if that's part of your question. The other one that came up here is, why is New York pizza considered one of the best? That's like an unanswerable question. It's just, it's a style that became the format for American pizza and the basis for, I think it's easy to say that it became the basis for like all the other big American styles, because New York City was a media center, and in the 50s, after the Second World War, people were exposed to that being pizza and not to Italian pizza. And so New York became the place of pizza more than Italy after the Second World War. But that's, and it's the water, obviously. And then there's a question over here. Karen's question about, I want to open this to all of us and then we'll get to John's. Is it fair to say Sean Randazzo popularized Detroit style pizza term locally and nationally, the term Detroit style pizza. So Sean Randazzo, by the way, he had a pizzeria called Detroit Style Pizza Company. He also did consulting and was the first person to make it and win with it at the International Pizza Challenge in Las Vegas in 2012. And so that's the basis for anybody who doesn't know his background. Do you all think that that's where the terminology and the popularity comes from?
She wrote the book on it, so I think she's had that as a statement. I don't think she was asking that. It was a question. So
oh yeah,
I
you're right.
believe
She
her.
said it's fair to say.
I
Yeah.
believe her. So I do have an example
definitely.
of that appearing in the Chicagoland neighborhood, I think in 1971 or two. So I think that's the earliest one I've been able to find. So I found that I found that after she did her book, unfortunately. Sorry, Karen. I wish I could have done it before, but yeah. So, but no, that was one ad in one shop, and I don't think that counts. I think Sean probably is the guy who we should give the credit to for that.
I mean, it's funny. Other people outside of Detroit use that term, but yeah, I know what Karen said. And by the way, for anybody watching, like, yeah, like Karen asked that question to make sure everybody hears the answer. In the same way, Steve asked the question about the different styles in Chicago. It's Steve's challenge in life to educate people on this kind of thing. So that's why he tossed that question out there. What about John's question? You want to go into the deep dish pizza and its similarity to pizza pasqualina in southern Italy?
I've not had that type of pizza. If someone could show me a photograph of that, or give me one of them, or show me what the fat content in the recipe is. I mean, for me, deep dish has to have a
In the
pan,
US.
and it has to have a lot of fat in it.
Yeah.
Not a super lot of fat, but a lot of fat in it. So if it has that, then I don't know if that inspired it. I would be suspicious if it did. I think that probably, if I had to guess, the inspiration for Ricardo was probably the Italian American neighborhood that was using that type of cake pan to bake bread in, and had about a 10 to 15% fat content in their ordinary pizzas at the time. One thing I think we should probably add, Scott, is that what we think of is the early New York pizza and the New Haven pizza, and I think Colin would agree with this. In fact, he was one of the early proponents of this. If we had to go back in time, we may just say that that was the pizza, the earliest pizza that had been being served in America for a pizzeria. And then we can go back and say, well, did something happen between the trip from Italy to America that changed the pizza? Or can we even go back further and saying that's an indication that earliest pizza was frozen in time here in America, but if we went back in time in Italy, we could see that same type of pizza, like a 7-minute cook time with the same sort of toppings that was being cooked back in Italy at the time. And I don't know that, but I'm interested in the way culture gets frozen once immigrants come to a different country like America, and things evolve in the home country, but for whatever reason, cultural things that were Italian get frozen in time here at the country where they went to. So I wonder, I'm putting this out as a hypothesis, if the same thing happened to pizza. So what we think of is pizza here in America that changed so radically from what you can get in Naples now. Whether that's really the case, and what we're just seeing now is really pizza that changed in Naples, particularly after World War II. And if we went back farther enough to the 19th century, we would see a similar type of pizza being made in Italy at the time. Now, of course, it's different because if you look back at the lithography, you see small biscuit-sized stuff. And so, but it's not necessarily the case that things changed radically once they came over. Maybe they didn't.
I mean, obviously, this is something that we can go into for eternity, but we've been talking about pizza for about 2 hours. And I want to let people get to back to their lives. The questions that have gone unanswered, if anybody wants to reach out, please do. Like, we'll be happy to send back answers to anybody. You can always email me directly. It's Scott@scottspizzatours.com. Peter, you can get to at pizzahistorybook.com is the website. And Stephanie, you can get it Swan, SSWANE on Instagram.
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah. So yeah, please let us know. And of course, anybody who's a tour guide or wants to become a tour guide, reach out to GANYC. I had all the information up before. We'll see if I can get it to you again. But I want to just there we go. I want to thank everybody for joining us and sticking on for a long time or watching the video for a long time. And yeah, any other questions anybody has, please send them out. Otherwise, enjoy the rest of National Pizza Month.